for Iran in light of the Arab awakening. Okay, Jonathan, I'd like to go back to you in London. We were talking about the nature of the Syrian regime and opposition and who benefits when things go wrong there. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I think it's important to note that what's happening in Syria, in the villages and cities of Syria, is not something that the Americans or the Hariris are cooking up, or even the Saudis. It is really an indigenous revolt against what I call a mafia rule of about 25 persons, just about 25 persons, no more, that have that run this country like it's their own ATM machine. That's the real fundamental problem. I agree that the Americans and the Israelis have been very slow and uncertain to support the opposition, and I think the Saudis likewise. But clearly, the fall of Assad would hurt Iran, and therefore Iran has every interest in portraying this as more of an even-handed battle between tanks on the one hand and unarmed civilians on the others. It's simply not even-handed.
Well, I don't think that's how Iran is portraying it.
Okay, Mohammed, go ahead.
Just very briefly, I just want to say that that's not how Iran is putting it. Iran is calling on the Syrian government to move forward with reforms, but at the same time, there is absolutely no doubt that the Saudis are deeply involved. And that doesn't mean that since they're involved, there's no legitimate grievances in Syria. But you have to keep in mind that unlike Mubarak, President Assad has been able to bring huge crowds into Damascus and other major cities. So he is not without his supporters. His foreign policy has been popular among his own people and segments of his own people at least. So it's not as if it's a one-sided game. He is popular and he has many enemies. But I think I'm no expert on Syria, so we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Soraya, I'd like to ask you a question. Yeah. It's interesting. I like a point you brought up earlier in the program about intentions and what making Syria unstable for possible regime change. Isn't it just maybe the United States and its allies are just looking for playing out a number of different options simultaneously and seeing which one is most attractive when they get to a point where they find it is attractive? It's not contradictory to have different approaches.
That's very true. I mean, it would not be very wise to have just one plan. They always have a plan B and C. But the United States clearly failed when it invaded countries, and it made it bankrupt. Now it's found a much cheaper way of undermining the regimes that are not friendly towards it. And in fact, in 2010, head of Israeli security addressed the Knesset and said that Syria is the biggest threat to Israel. And if they continue on the path they're continuing, they would send Israel back to its 1967 borders. And so Syria is a huge concern of Israel's. For one thing, they want the Golan Heights back, and Israel will not negotiate on that. And I think any analyst would agree that the United States foreign policy is there to cater to the Israelis' national interest. And the chaos obviously divides the country.
I disagree.
For some reason, Jonathan, I thought you would. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I think that's ludicrous. That's absolutely nonsense. Israel has enjoyed 32 years of peace with Syria on the Golan Heights. They're absolutely delighted with the stability they have with Syria, and that's precisely the reason why they're not pushing to have Assad thrown under the truck the way Obama threw Mubarak under the truck. There are different situations. Each country is different, but
so are they happy with Hamas being in Syria or Hezbollah being supported?
All right, Mohammed and Turan, go ahead. Good point.
Well, I think that the Israelis definitely do not like the Syrian president. Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah are all supported and backed by Syria. And Syria is the only Arab neighbor of Israel, besides Lebanon, which is a very different case altogether, that hasn't signed a border agreement with Israelis. They are effectively in a state of war. And as the situation changes in Egypt, and of course it's complicated, who knows what's going to happen in Egypt. But I think that whether the Americans like it or not, there are forces at play in Egypt that will cause more pressure on the government to support the people in Gaza. And I think that in general, when you have a situation like that with Syria, which is supporting these groups, and then you have a new situation in Gaza, the Israelis will definitely be feeling more and more uncomfortable, to say the least.
Soraya, it's good. Go ahead. I was going to go to you anyway. Go ahead.
It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling that Jonathan should say they've lived in peace for 32 years with Syria, the Israelis and Syrians, whereas in fact a couple of years ago they bombed illegally the Syrian nuclear program. And again, as Professor Merendie in Tehran said, they've never had a good relationship with Syria. And what bothers Israel more than anything, in fact, is the fact that Syria has always remained an ally of Iran. And Iran for Israel is boogeyman. And without an Iranian threat that's of their own creation, Israel wouldn't be getting the aid from the United States. It wouldn't be acting the way it does without anybody stopping their illegal activities and their murders and their the encroachment on Palestinian land.
Okay, Jonathan, I want to change gears here. I'd like to, and I'm going to think about the paper that you wrote, your recent paper on Iran. Let's talk about how these, if we call it a revolution or revolt or awakening or spring or whatever we want to collectively call it, what's happening in North Africa, how is it going to affect Iran on the ground? On the ground.
Well, that's a difficult one to say. I think Iran found a formula for crushing the opposition in 2009 after the fraudulent elections, allegedly fraudulent elections, where Ahmadinejad allegedly won 65% of the vote, and then you had a mass outpouring of people in the cities of Tehran, but ultimately through a combination of brute force. Well, in any event, what happened in North Africa is really quite different. They may have learned some Twitter techniques from the Iranian Revolution, but what happened in Iran, what happened in Tunisia and Egypt were fundamentally
Jonathan, those Twitter techniques were traced back to Israel, incidentally.
Well, I'm sorry, you're sort of
it was not Iranian.
Look.
If I could make a point
in California.
Let me just say one thing.
Wait a minute. I didn't finish my point. I mean, you're so obsessed with America and with Israel. I'm trying to say that what the Arab Spring is about is it's about the lack of governance. It's about the lack of personal freedom. It's about a lot of things that the Tunisian and the Egyptian people felt. So I wouldn't say that it was impacted by Iran. However, I would say that the problems that the people of Tunisia and Egypt are suffering from are not different from the problems that people in Iran are suffering from.
Okay, Professor Merendie, I want you to go ahead. Go ahead, jump in, go.
Well, first of all, very quickly, in Iran, I didn't vote for Mr. Ahmadinejad. I'm not a fan of Mr. Ahmadinejad, but he won the elections legitimately. There was absolutely no fraud. The polls carried out by Americans showed it. The polls carried out by Iranians showed it. And even Mousavi's representative in the Ministry of the Interior, who had 40,000 volunteers, said specifically 5 days after the election that there was no fraud. But regardless of Iran, what is happening? North Africa, the issue of good governance is very important. I agree with you completely on that. And the issue of corruption and dignity. But also, I think what is very important, regardless of who is managing these revolutions and what direction it is taking, the people of the region are very angry towards their leaders for blindly supporting the United States and aiding the United States in its support for apartheid policies in Palestine. The people of the region dislike Israel immensely, not because they are Jewish, but because there is a Zionist ideology that dominates the land, and the people of Palestine are treated as dirt. They're not treated as human beings. And that is very central to how people in this region feel.
Soraya, you wanted to chime in on that?
I do agree with Professor Merendie 100%. I also want to point out that, yes, Iran does deal with protests, but also understand that the support for the regime in Iran comes from the people. Unlike the Egyptian scenario or Tunisia, where it was the United States and Israel that supported those countries. So even if there is an uprising in Iran, the majority of the people do support the regime and the president, and it's just a show of numbers.
Okay, Jonathan, if I can go back to you in London, of course, at the center of American forum. Go right ahead.
I'm thunderstruck by this whole analysis, but I don't know where to begin. I think it's utter nonsense. Utter nonsense. The Iranian people do not support Ahmadinejad. That's utter nonsense. And human rights violations. Soraya, human rights. Wait, excuse me, Soraya. I'm speaking now. You listen.
Yes.
Soraya, human rights violations. Compare tanks in Syria shooting unarmed civilians. Compare what the Basij did to poor Neda in Tehran. Compare that to whatever you think Israelis are doing to Palestinians.
Okay. Well, does anybody want?
You guys are spewing propaganda. This is the Tehran propaganda show we're on. Wonderful.
Jonathan. The United States and the West defeated. Tim Marshall. When Osama bin Laden, there was a caption last week on Sky News. Osama bin Laden says there will not be peace in Palestine until the rights of Palestinians are there. They interrupted Tim Marshall, who was watching the massacre in Homs of Syrian, supported by Iran, by the way, of Syrian tanks. And Tim Marshall said, come off it. Everybody I talked to, from Benghazi to Cairo, to Tunisia, and now here in Homs, says we reject the big lie that says it's Israel's fault.
All right, I'm going to give Professor Merendie the last word.
Wait a minute. Tim Marshall explained this has been used by the leaders of these countries to deny their people freedom. That's what.
All right, I'm sorry. We've run out of time, folks. We've run out of time. Run out of time. Thank you for this very spirited debate. Many thanks to my guests today in Tehran, London, and in Irvine. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.